the Pan American Highway Book 2, The Descent into the Tropics, the 1968 Chronicle of a High-Pressure Steam Automaton and an Indomitable Mechanic by Mark Twain. Copyright 2026, James Henderson and Mark Twain. If you enjoy these audiobooks and don't want to miss out on new ones, it would be bully if you like and subscribe. Or if you want to be a rapscallion and miss out, then have it your way. Also, please feel free to leave suggestions for future topics. Shall we continue? Preface. In Book 1, The Road to the Pearl of the West, we were introduced to a steam-powered literary cynic, a grease-stained optimist, and a 1957 Volkswagen Beetle with a terrifying knack for survival. When Ennie and the analytical brass automaton Mark Twain set out to drive the Pan American Highway from the frozen heart of Alaska to the southernmost tip of Argentina, the odds of survival were mathematically microscopic. Part 1 chronicles their harrowing, hilarious descent across the North American continent, battling Arctic carburetor ice, the treacherous switchbacks of the Rockies, vapor-locking desert heat, and the neon mirages of Las Vegas. The duo survives on nothing but baling wire, discarded kitchenware, and sheer unyielding willpower. It is a sprawling testament to the absurdity of the human condition, the romance of the open road, and the stubborn refusal of a 40-horsepower German tin can to die. We now continue with Book 2, The Descent into the Tropics. Chapter 21. Mexico City Traffic. To travel from the colonial elegance of Guadalajara to the sprawling high-altitude delirium of Mexico City is to participate in a slow-motion strangulation of one's internal combustion. As our sky-blue 1957 Volkswagen Beetle rattled upward, ascending toward the central plateau, the very atmosphere began to thin out, retreating from the earth like a discouraged creditor. By the time my internal barometers registered 7,000 feet above sea level, the air possessed all the structural integrity of a poorly whispered rumor. For a mechanical entity such as myself, powered by a coal-fired boiler and a closed-loop steam system, the altitude is merely a matter of adjusting the draft on my firebox. For our German tin can, however, it was a respiratory crisis. The little 4-cylinder engine in the boot, which had spent the morning humming a frantic but steady tune, was now gasping for oxygen with the desperation of a stranded trout. It coughed, it sputtered, and it emitted a plume of black, soot-heavy exhaust that suggested the carburetor was attempting to solve the lack of air by throwing an excessive amount of gasoline at the problem, a strategy I have often seen employed by mid-level government bureaucrats when faced with a budget deficit. "She's choking, Mr. Twain," Ennie shouted over the ragged, uneven rhythm of the motor. She was hunched over the wheel, her eyes darting between the empty road ahead and the vibrating rear-view mirror. "The fuel-to-air ratio is all wrong. There's just not enough air in the air." "A profound observation, Ennie," I replied, my voice box grinding with a dry, metallic resonance. I adjusted my optical focus, my brass irises clicking as they dilated to capture the hazy, sun-bleached horizon. "We are currently navigating a vacuum. If this elevation increases by another 1,000 feet, I calculate that the engine will cease to be an instrument of propulsion and become a very expensive, very noisy paperweight. I suggest we perform a localized mechanical intervention before we are overtaken by a determined pedestrian." Ennie didn't wait for a second opinion. She steered the staggering Beetle onto a narrow, dusty shoulder overlooking a valley that seemed to stretch into eternity. Before the dust had even settled, she was out of the car, her heavy metal toolbox clanking against her hip. I unlatched my passenger door with a weary scree-clack and stepped out. The air was cool, crisp, and thin enough to make a human dizzy, though I merely found it refreshing from my external cooling fins. I trudged to the rear, where Ennie had the engine deck lid open. The heat radiating from the compartment was intense, smelling of hot oil and the metallic tang of our improvised coffee tin preheater. "I have to lean her out," she muttered, her fingers dancing over the brass screws of the Solex carburetor. She wasn't just turning a screw, she was listening, her head tilted to catch the minute shifts in the engine's labored breathing. A half-turn clockwise, maybe 3/4. We need to starve her of fuel just enough so she doesn't drown in the thin air. "It is a delicate surgery," I noted, leaning heavily on my brass walking stick. "One wrong move and we shall be stranded in the clouds, left to be reclaimed by the elements like a forgotten Mayan ruin." With a final triumphant click of her screwdriver, she signaled for me to start the car. I reached in, turned the key, and the engine erupted into a crisp, high-pitched chatter. The black smoke vanished, replaced by a clean, rhythmic thrum. The patient had been revived. Next stop, the Capitol. Ennie cheered, slamming the lid and hopping back into the driver's seat. However, no amount of mechanical genius could have prepared us for the sensory assault that is Mexico City traffic in 1968. As we descended into the Valley of Mexico, the city did not so much appear as it did engulf us. It was a sprawling gray leviathan of concrete and steel, a metropolis of such staggering proportions that it seemed to have no beginning and no end, and the traffic, heaven help the soul of any man or machine caught within it, was a localized manifestation of pure, unadulterated chaos. Imagine, if you will, a river composed entirely of rusted metal, screaming rubber, and human indignation. There were thousands of cars, thousands. A significant portion of them were fellow Volkswagens, Vochos, as the locals called them, scurrying about like metallic beetles in a frantic, overcrowded colony. They were joined by massive, smoke-belching buses painted in garish primary colors, sleek American sedans that looked like chrome-plated sharks, and thousands of motorbikes weaving through the gaps with a suicidal disregard for the laws of physics. "Ennie," I stated, my internal gyroscope spinning in a state of high-frequency panic as a lime-green bus missed our front fender by a fraction of an inch. I have witnessed the chaotic migrations of the great buffalo herds on the American plains. I have seen the frantic scurrying of ants in a disturbed hill. But I have never seen a collective of sentient beings so thoroughly dedicated to the pursuit of mutual destruction via the automobile. "It's just energetic," Ennie yelled, her knuckles white on the steering wheel as she dodged a dented taxi. "You just have to find the rhythm, Mr. Twain. It's like a dance." "It is a dance performed by the deranged upon a floor made of landmines," I countered, venting a massive, pressurized plume of steam from my mechanical cigar. The white vapor swirled out the window, momentarily startling a nearby driver in a battered Chevy. "I am currently calculating our probability of reaching the Zocalo without a structural redistribution of our chassis. The numbers are trending toward the dismal." The noise was absolute, a continuous, deafening wall of sound composed of blaring horns, shrieking brakes, and the rhythmic, guttural shouting of street vendors. The air was a thick, gray soup of exhaust fumes and dust, so dense that I was forced to engage my secondary air filters just to keep my logic engines from choking on the particulate matter. We were currently trapped on the Paseo de la Reforma, a grand sweeping boulevard modeled after the Champs-Élysées, though I suspect the French never intended their design to be used as a high-speed obstacle course for 6 million people. Colossal monuments rose from the center of traffic circles, the Angel of Independence, Diana the Huntress, looking down with stony indifference upon the metallic madness below. "Look at that!" Ennie pointed toward a massive construction site where the earth had been torn open to reveal concrete tunnels and steel ribs. "They're building the metro. 1968 is the year of progress, Mr. Twain. The Olympics are coming this October. The whole city is transforming." "Transformation is often a polite word for organized ruin," I grumbled, watching a man on a bicycle balance 3 crates of chickens while navigating a 4-lane merge. "They are building tunnels to move people beneath the ground because they have officially run out of room on top of it. It is a subterranean admission of defeat." We spent the next 3 hours traveling a distance that a reasonably fit tortoise could have covered in 20 minutes. The Beetle's clutch was beginning to protest, emitting a faint, acrid scent of toasted friction material. The improvised cabin heater, still pumping out its relentless, oily warmth, was making the interior a sweltering purgatory. "Ennie," I said, my vocal gears vibrating with the residual shock of our 10th near miss. "I am a machine built for the observation of the human condition, but after observing this traffic, my primary conclusion is that humanity should never have been granted the wheel. You are a species of explorers who have successfully managed to trap yourselves in a stationary honking box of your own making." "We're not stationary, we're pausing." Ennie smiled, finally spotting an opening and diving the Beetle into a narrow side street that promised a reprieve from the main boulevard. "And look, we made it to the historic center." We emerged into the shadow of the Metropolitan Cathedral, a massive, brooding masterpiece of stone that seemed to be slowly sinking into the ancient lakebed upon which the city was built. The Zocalo, the vast central plaza, spread out before us, a sea of gray stone beneath a sky that was struggling to remain blue through the smog. Ennie pulled the car into a narrow, crowded parking area and killed the engine. The silence that followed was not absolute. The city still hummed with a distant, frenetic energy, but the cessation of our own rattling vibration felt like a benediction. "We're here," she breathed, leaning back and wiping a fresh layer of grease and soot from her forehead. "The heart of Mexico. We survived the highest, busiest part of the whole trip." "We have survived a localized apocalypse," I corrected her, unlatching my door and stepping out onto the uneven pavement. I took a long, steadying draw from my cigar and watched the steam rise towards the ancient stone towers. "But I must admit, Ennie, there is a certain terrifying vitality to this place. It is a city that refuses to be quiet, refuses to be still, and refuses to let a mechanical man have a moment of peace." Ennie laughed, her youthful face radiant in the fading afternoon light. "That's the spirit. Now, let's find some chocolate and a place to rest. Tomorrow, we head for the ruins of Oaxaca." I adjusted my bowler hat, my brass joints clicking in the thin, vibrant air. The Pan-American Highway had tried to choke us with altitude and crush us with traffic, but the mechanical man and the optimist were still standing. "Lead the way, Ennie," I sighed. "But if I see another lime green bus, I am declaring a state of emergency and retiring to a museum." Chapter 22. Oaxaca Ruins. The departure from the sprawling, oxygen-starved delirium of Mexico City felt remarkably like escaping a pressurized steam boiler just seconds before the rivets began to pop. We had survived the high-altitude mechanical strangulation and the motorized gladiatorial combat of the capital's boulevards. But as our sky-blue 1957 Volkswagen Beetle rattled southward toward the state of Oaxaca, the continent decided to present a new variety of topographical treachery. The road was no longer a multi-lane artery of urban chaos. It had reverted to a winding two-lane ribbon of sun-baked asphalt that clung desperately to the rugged contours of the Sierra Madre del Sur. On either side, the landscape transformed into a dramatic tapestry of deep-shadowed valleys and jagged limestone ridges. The air, while still thin enough to make a biological entity lightheaded, had lost the acrid gray soup of Mexico City's exhaust, replaced by the scent of dry earth, toasted corn, and the faint, sweet aroma of blooming agave. Inside our violently vibrating tin can, the climate remained a localized catastrophe. My internal cooling fans were whining in a weary, high-pitched drone, fighting a continuous battle against the radiant heat of the Oaxacan sun. Ennie's terrifying improvised cabin heater, the bypass of aluminum dryer ducting mated to the exhaust headers, was still providing a relentless, oily warmth that I found entirely unnecessary for my metallurgy. "Do you feel that, Mr. Twain?" Ennie shouted over the deafening clatter of the air-cooled engine. She had both windows rolled down, her grease-smudged face leaning into the hot, dry wind. Her hair was a chaotic nest of curls, and she looked as though she had been lightly breaded in Mexican road dust. "The rhythm is different down here. It's slower, more ancient. We're getting close to the heart of the Zapotec world." "What I feel, Ennie," I replied, my vocal gears grinding with a dry resonance, "is the steady, systematic disintegration of my lower logic boards. Every pothole on this highway is a calculated assault by the 19th century upon the 20th. I am currently calculating the stress on our front kingpins, and the probability of our wheels departing for independent vacations is reaching a statistical certainty." "Oh, the bug loves the dirt," she laughed, downshifting with a brutal crunch as we began the steep, winding ascent toward the ruins of Monte Alban. "She's a mountain goat in a German suit." The climb to Monte Alban is a vertical argument with history itself. The ancient city sits atop an artificially leveled mountain overlooking the three valleys of Oaxaca from a height of nearly 6,000 feet. As we ascended the narrow switchback road, the Beetle's four-cylinder heart began to labor with a wet, struggling chug, chug, chug. Ennie's improvised coffee tin preheater, still strapped to the exhaust, rattled with a rhythmic metallic protest that sounded like a skeletal percussion section. We finally crested the summit and pulled the gasping, overheated vehicle into a dusty parking area. Ennie killed the ignition, and the engine did not so much stop as it expired with a long thermal hiss of relief. "We're here," she breathed, hopping out of the car and wiping a fresh layer of soot from her forehead. "The great plaza of Monte Alban." I unlatched my passenger door with a heavy metallic scree-clack. I stepped out onto the parched earth, my heavy copper boots hitting the ground with a definitive, ringing thud that seemed to echo across the centuries. I adjusted my bowler hat. took a slow, highly pressurized draw from my mechanical cigar, and exhaled a long, straight column of white steam. The sight that greeted my glass-lensed eyes was, quite frankly, an affront to my sense of modern superiority. Spread out before us was a vast man-made plateau, a colossal architectural achievement carved directly out of the mountaintop nearly 2,000 years ago. Massive stepped pyramids rose from the earth like petrified titans, their limestone blocks fitted together with a precision that made our Beetle's door gaps look like canyon ravines. Huge open plazas, grand staircases, and strange astronomical observatories stood in a state of magnificent weathered silence. "Observe the engineering, Ennie," I drawled, leaning heavily on my brass walking stick as we began to stroll across the great plaza. These Zapotec builders did not possess the internal combustion engine. They did not possess hydraulic lifts, steel cranes, or even the wheel for hauling. Yet they leveled a mountain and erected a city that has remained standing while empires crumbled, religions mutated, and the very concept of progress was reinvented a dozen times. Ennie stopped at the base of the massive north platform, her eyes tracing the intricate stonework. She reached out a grease-smudged hand and gently touched a weathered block of limestone. "It's the joinery," she whispered, her voice devoid of its usual bounce, replaced by a hushed, mechanical reverence. "Look at the lack of mortar, Mr. Twain. They didn't just stack rocks. They shaped them to lock together. It's a structural interference fit on a planetary scale. This city wasn't built. It was assembled with the precision of a watch. Only the parts weigh 10 tons each." "Precisely," I agreed, venting a small contemplative puff of steam. "In my manufactured life, I have been told that we live in the space age. We have computers that can calculate the trajectory of a moon landing and vehicles that can traverse a continent at 60 miles per hour. Yet, we build our homes out of flimsy timber and our cars out of sheet metal no thicker than a soup can. We are a civilization of the temporary, Ennie. We build things to last a decade, while these primitive people built things to last an eternity. We climbed the steep, narrow steps of a temple, my heavy brass joints clicking and whirring with every exertion. From the summit, the view was staggering. The valleys of Oaxaca spread out below us, a patchwork of green and gold shimmering in the midday heat. The ruins themselves felt like a giant stone logic gate, an ancient analytical engine designed to track the stars and the seasons. "Do you think they ever felt like we do?" Ennie asked, sitting on the edge of a stone ledge, her boots dangling over the abyss. "Dashing around, trying to fix things, worried about the next road? Or did they just exist in the stone?" "They were humans, Ennie," I replied, seating my heavy frame beside her with a metallic creak. "Therefore, they were undoubtedly obsessed with trivialities. They worried about the price of corn, the infidelity of their neighbors, and the fact that their ritual calendars were 3 seconds out of alignment with the solstice. They were just as frantic as we are. They simply had a better sense of masonry." I looked over at our tiny sky-blue beetle sitting in the distance, looking like a lost metallic insect against the backdrop of the massive pyramids. "Think of the contrast," I continued, gesturing with a heavy copper finger. "Our vehicle is a triumph of complexity and fragility. It requires a constant supply of refined dinosaurs, a delicate balance of electricity and spark, and a young woman with a wrench to prevent it from dissolving into a pile of rust. It is a masterpiece of the moment. These ruins, however, require nothing. They do not rust. They do not run out of fuel. They simply endure. Maybe that's why we're on this trip. Ennie smiled, looking at me with her bright, unkillable optimism. To see the difference. The stone stays put to remind us where we've been, and the machine keeps moving to show us where we can go. You need both to have a story. An uncharacteristically poetic observation, I grumbled, though I found myself adjusting my optical focus to take in the sheer, staggering symmetry of the plaza once more. But I suspect the story would be significantly shorter if we were attempting to drive a stone pyramid to Argentina. We spent several hours exploring the danzantes, strange carved figures that lined the base of one of the structures, and the mysterious Building J, a triangular observatory that stood at an odd angle to the rest of the city. Ennie was fascinated by the drainage systems, tracing the stone gutters with a professional eye, while I contemplated the Zapotec understanding of time, which seemed far more circular and patient than our own. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the limestone, we began our descent. The air grew cooler, and the ruins seemed to settle deeper into the mountain, their secrets guarded by the approaching twilight. "Well," Ennie said, as we reached the parked Beetle. She patted the dusty, painted metal of the hood. "Time to return to the 1968 version of engineering. We've got a long haul tomorrow. The roads south of here are supposed to get even tighter." "Then I suggest we check our brake fluid," I sighed, unlatching my door. I have no desire to test the structural integrity of our chassis against the ancient stonework of a Oaxacan valley. I took one last look at Monte Alban, the great stone city on the hill, before sliding back into my scalding, oil-scented seat. The Pan-American Highway was calling us back to the world of movement and vibration, but for a few hours we had stood in the presence of the permanent. "Lead on, Ennie," I muttered, as the engine roared back to life with its familiar deafening clatter. "Let us see if our space-age tin can survive the next century of road." Chapter 23. The Snapped Cable. The transition from the arid limestone heights of Oaxaca to the emerald vertical chaos of the Guatemalan Highlands was not a descent, but a plunge into a humid, prehistoric green. By the time our sky-blue 1957 Volkswagen Beetle rattled across the border, a process involving a staggering amount of paperwork and a local official who spent 20 minutes trying to find a steam-powered literature category on his customs form. The geography had become actively malicious. Guatemala in 1968 is not a country designed for the timid or the poorly geared. It is a vertical tapestry of soaring volcanic peaks, deep, mist-shrouded ravines, and roads that seem to have been laid out by a surveyor with a profound hatred for horizontal surfaces. The Pan-American Highway here is a narrow, winding ribbon of asphalt and gravel that clings to the edges of cliffs with a tenuous, white-knuckled grip. Inside our rolling convection oven, the atmosphere was thick enough to carve. Ennie's improvised cabin heater, the bypass of aluminum dryer ducting mated to the exhaust headers, was still pumping its relentless oily warmth onto my brass shins. My internal cooling fans were whining in a weary, high-pitched drone, fighting a continuous battle against the tropical humidity that threatened to cloud my vacuum tubes with a permanent, damp malaise. "Look at the mist in the valleys, Mr. Twain!" Ennie shouted over the frantic sewing machine clatter of the air-cooled engine. She was wrestling the steering wheel with an intensity that suggested she was engaged in a wrestling match with a very stubborn bear. Her grease-smudged face was flush with the thrill of the climb, and she had the sleeves of her jumpsuit rolled up to her shoulders. "It looks like the world is still being made out there. It's primeval." "It is a humid purgatory, Ennie," I replied, my vocal gears grinding with a dry, metallic resonance. I adjusted my optical focus, my brass irises clicking as they dilated to capture the vibrant, suffocating greenery. "We are currently navigating a geological obstacle course that would give a mountain goat a nervous breakdown. I am currently calculating the stress on our fourth-gear synchronizer, and the probability of our engine simply giving up the ghost and retreating back to the Mexican border is reaching a statistical certainty." "Oh, the bug loves the challenge," she laughed, downshifting with a brutal crunch as we hit a grade so steep it felt as though we were attempting to drive up a waterfall. "She's a climber. Just a little more throttle and—" The word "and" was never completed. It was replaced by a sharp, metallic ping. The sound was subtle, like the breaking of a high-tension wire on a piano, but its effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Ennie's left foot, which had been pressing the clutch pedal in preparation for the shift, suddenly hit the floorboard with a violent, unobstructed thud. The pedal offered no resistance. It simply fell limp, like a dead bird. "Uh-oh," Ennie whispered, her eyes widening. "I am not an expert in the nomenclature of human distress," I noted, my internal heart relays clicking in a frantic, panicked rhythm as the engine roared in neutral and our forward momentum vanished. "But I believe 'uh-oh' is the understated preamble to a monumental calamity. Why are we currently rolling backward toward a 3,000-foot abyss?" "Clutch cable snapped!" she yelled, standing on the brake pedal with both feet. The Beetle shuddered to a halt, perched precariously on a 40-degree incline. To our left was a wall of damp, mossy rock. To our right was a sheer drop into a sea of mist and giant ferns. The engine was still idling with a frantic, oblivious rattle, but the mechanical link between the motor and the wheels had been severed. "We are officially a stationary ornament," I announced, venting a massive pressurized plume of steam from my mechanical cigar. The white vapor swirled out the window, momentarily startling a colorful Quetzal bird perched on a nearby branch. "I presume your toolbox contains a spare 9-foot length of high-tensile German steel cable specifically designed for a 1957 transaxle." "Of course not," Ennie grunted, pulling the handbrake with a ratcheting click and throwing the car into first gear to keep it from rolling. She wiped a bead of sweat from her nose, inadvertently smearing her grease smudge. "I have fan belts, I have spark plugs, I have a carburetor rebuild kit. I do not have a clutch cable. They almost never snap like that." "And yet," I observed, "the word 'almost' is currently the only thing standing between us and a permanent residence at the bottom of this ravine." We were stranded. The road was empty, the jungle was loud with the calls of unseen monkeys, and the nearest town was a shimmering mirage somewhere on the other side of the volcanic ridge. But, as is the fundamental law of our journey, the road provided, though in a form that defied all rational engineering. From around the bend, A small, brightly painted pickup truck appeared, its bed overflowing with crates of coffee and a group of local musicians. They were laughing and strumming instruments, their colorful textiles a vibrant contrast to the green walls of the forest. As they spotted our sky-blue beetle perched on the edge of the cliff, they slowed to a halt. A young man hopped down from the truck, a battered acoustic guitar strapped to his back. He wore a wide-brimmed straw hat and a smile that seemed to possess its own gravitational pull. "Problemas, amigos?" he asked, his voice a warm, resonant baritone. "Clutch cable!" Ennie shouted, miming the snapping of a wire with her hands. "Broken! Snapped! Roto!" The young man walked over to the back of the Beetle, looking down at the empty engine bay where the cable normally emerged from the chassis. He winced, then looked at his guitar. He turned to his companions in the truck and shouted something in a rapid-fire dialect I couldn't quite translate. One of the older musicians laughed and tossed a small rectangular box toward him. The young man caught it and turned to Ennie. "Es muy fuerte," he said, holding up a package of heavy-duty steel-core guitar strings. "Para el bajo," for the bass. Ennie's eyes lit up with a terrifying improvisational genius that I have learned to fear more than the road itself. "Mr. Twain," she breathed, grabbing the package of strings. "He's a genius. If I can double braid these and anchor them to the throw-out arm, we can bridge the gap to the remaining stump of the original cable." "Ennie," I said slowly, my vocal gears vibrating with alarm, "you are proposing to operate a 1,000-pound motor vehicle using the musical accessories of a traveling folk band. This is not engineering. This is a vaudeville act." "It's tension and tensile strength," she argued, already diving into her toolbox. "Steel is steel, Mr. Twain, and right now we're going to play a very heavy tune." For the next hour, I stood guard at the rear of the Beetle, serving as a highly sophisticated, steam-powered paperweight, while Ennie performed open-heart surgery on the undercarriage. She lay flat on her back in the red Guatemalan dirt, her flashlight cutting through the dim shadows beneath the chassis. The musicians gathered around, fascinated. They didn't seem to mind the delay. In fact, they pulled out a marimba and a few more guitars and began a rhythmic, soulful accompaniment to Ennie's grunts of exertion and the clink-clink of her wrenches. I sat on the bumper, venting rhythmic puffs of steam in time with the music. "Observe the absurdity, Ennie," I drawled, projecting my voice over the marimba. "We are currently attempting a transcontinental expedition in a German car held together by baling wire, coffee tins, and now the string of a Guatemalan folk singer. If my creators could see me now, they would undoubtedly delete my personality matrix out of sheer embarrassment." "Got it!" Ennie's voice echoed from beneath the car. She emerged, covered from head to toe in red mud and transmission grease, but her face was radiant with a triumphant grin. She had managed to thread the heavy-duty guitar strings through the guide tube, braiding them together and anchoring them to the clutch arm with a series of complex improvised knots and a few well-placed hose clamps. "Okay, Mr. Twain," she panted, hopping into the driver's seat. Moment of truth. She depressed the pedal. It didn't feel quite right. It had a strange, springy resonance, and as she pushed it to the floor, the car emitted a low musical thrum. "It works!" she cheered, throwing the car into gear. "It's not perfect, and I have to be really gentle with the shifts, but we have a clutch. The musicians erupted into cheers and applause. Ennie reached into her pocket and handed the young man a handful of pesos and a high-quality American screwdriver as thanks. He tipped his hat, hopped back into his truck, and they disappeared around the bend, the sound of the marimba fading into the mist. Ennie wrestled the Beetle back onto the road, the engine roaring as we resumed our climb. Every time she shifted gears, the car let out a faint melodic twang that vibrated through the floorboards. "We are traveling in a motorized instrument," I noted, settling back into my scalding, oil-scented seat. "I am currently being propelled toward South America by a C major chord. It is the most ridiculous situation I have ever encountered, and I have spent time in Las Vegas. It works, doesn't it?" Ennie smiled, her eyes focused on the winding road toward Lake Atitlan. "It works," I conceded, taking a long, deep draw from my mechanical cigar. "But if we pass a violin shop, I am insisting on a full orchestral tune-up. Drive on, Ennie. Let us see what other musical masterpieces you can conjure from this wreckage." Chapter 24. Guatemala's Lake Atitlan. The air-cooled engine of our sky-blue 1957 Volkswagen Beetle was currently singing a very specific and highly annoying tune. Thanks to the improvisational genius of my companion and the high-tensile contributions of a traveling folk band, every time Ennie depressed the clutch pedal, the vehicle emitted a sharp, resonant twang in the key of G major. It was as if we were being propelled across the Guatemalan Highlands by a giant motorized banjo. "Ennie," I stated, my vocal gears grinding with a dry metallic resonance that competed with our new musical accompaniment. I adjusted my optical focus, my brass irises clicking as they dilated to capture the vibrant, terrifyingly steep terrain. "I am a mechanical man of letters, programmed for the appreciation of sophisticated prose and cynical wit. I did not sign up to be the rhythm section for a four-cylinder German percussion ensemble. This musical clutch is a localized assault on my auditory sensors." Ennie, per usual, was entirely immune to my suffering. She sat behind the thin rim of the steering wheel in her grease-stained mechanic's jumpsuit, her sleeves rolled up past her elbows, a sheen of perspiration highlighting the permanent smudge of dark grease on her cheek. She was tapping her thumbs against the wheel in time with the twang-rattle-thrum of our progress. "Oh, hush, Mr. Twain," she laughed, her bright voice cutting through the mechanical din. "It's got character. Besides, the tension on those guitar strings is holding up beautifully. We're navigating these volcanic grades better than we did the Rockies. It's all about the harmony between the machine and the music." "Harmony," I countered, bracing my heavy copper arms against the painted metal dashboard as we crested a final mist-shrouded ridge, "is what occurs when a machine functions according to its original blueprints. What we have here is a structural hallucination. We are one snapped high E string away from a silent backwards plunge into a prehistoric ravine. But as we rounded the final switchback, even my cynical logic circuits were forced to pause and process the sheer staggering majesty unfolding before us. Below lay Lake Atitlan. It did not look like a body of water. It looked like a colossal cobalt jewel that had been dropped into the jagged green maw of a volcanic crater. The water was a deep, impossible blue, so still it mirrored the sky with a crystalline precision that made my internal gyroscope spin in a state of high-frequency disorientation. Surrounding the lake were three massive, silent sentinels, the volcanoes Toloman, Atitlan, and San Pedro. Their cone-shaped peaks tore through the swirling white mists, their slopes draped in a carpet of emerald vegetation so dense it seemed to pulsate with a life of its own. "Stop the car, Ennie," I whispered, the mechanical grind of my voice dropping in pitch. My optical sensors require a moment to calibrate this level of geographical arrogance. This landscape is a flamboyant display of nature's creative excess. Ennie pulled the rattling Beetle onto a narrow, dusty overlook. She killed the ignition, and the sudden silence, interrupted only by the faint, dying ping of the guitar string clutch, felt like a physical weight. We stepped out of the vehicle, our boots crunching on the volcanic soil. The air was cool, smelling of wood smoke, wet earth, and the faint, sweet aroma of roasting coffee beans. We spent the afternoon descending into the lakeside village of Panajachel. The streets were a vibrant, narrow maze of stone and dust, populated by the local Maya people whose ancestors had farmed these slopes for millennia. The sensory experience was a staggering departure from the gray urban chaos of Mexico City. Here, the world was a riot of primary colors, vibrant reds, deep purples, and brilliant yellows woven into the huipalas, traditional blouses, worn by the women. As we walked through the bustling marketplace, my heavy copper footsteps ringing like a struck anvil on the cobblestones, we were approached by a group of Maya weavers. They were seated on the ground, their backstrap looms attached to the sturdy trunks of ceiba trees. I stood perfectly still, my glass lens eyes whirring as I analyzed the mechanism of the backstrap loom. To a casual observer, it is a simple arrangement of sticks and thread. To a mechanical man, however, it is a sophisticated, hand-powered, analytical engine. "Observe, Ennie," I drawled, gesturing with a heavy copper finger toward the rhythmic motion of a weaver's hands. The warp and the weft. It is a binary system of staggering complexity. Every thread is a line of code. Every pass of the shuttle is a logical operation. Long before my creator, Charles Babbage, conceived of his difference engine, these women were using a portable, organic computer to program the geometry of the universe into their textiles. Ennie knelt beside one of the weavers, a young woman with nimble fingers and a smile that seemed to understand the logic of the thread far better than I ever could. Ennie didn't reach for a wrench. She reached for a stray piece of dyed cotton, her fingers tracing the intricate geometric patterns. "It's beautiful, Mr. Twain," Ennie whispered, her voice devoid of its usual bounce. "Look at the tension. If she pulls too hard, the pattern distorts. If she's too loose, the fabric fails. It's exactly like tuning a carburetor or setting the gap on a spark plug. It's about balance." "Precisely," I agreed, venting a small contemplative puff of steam from my mechanical cigar. I leaned down, my brass joints clicking, to observe the weaver's work. The pattern was a series of stylized birds and stars, rendered in a precision that defied the simplicity of her tools. She is weaving the history of her people into a garment. I, on the other hand, am currently weaving a narrative of mechanical failure across a continent. I suspect her work will outlast mine by several centuries. The weaver looked up at me, her dark eyes reflecting the glowing amber warmth of the vacuum tubes visible behind my ribbed sternum. She did not look frightened. She looked curious. She reached out and touched my copper forearm, her fingers tracing the rivets with the same care she used on her loom. "She says, 'You are a man made of the mountains,'" a young boy translated from nearby, his eyes wide as he watched the steam hiss from my cigar. "She says, 'Your heart is a fire that does not go out, but your skin is cold like the stone.'" "A remarkably accurate assessment," I replied, adjusting my bowler hat with a sharp, mechanical click. "Tell her that my skin is a product of Victorian industry, but my heart, if we are to use such a flimsy biological metaphor, is currently struggling with the humidity of her beautiful country." Ennie spent the next hour in a spirited, largely non-verbal exchange with the weavers. She showed them her heavy chrome wrenches and her prized screwdriver. They showed her the specific tension required to create a perfect diamond pattern in the thread. It was a meeting of two different kinds of mechanics, one dedicated to the preservation of internal combustion, the other to the preservation of ancient geometry. As the sun began to dip behind the Toliman volcano, casting a long violet shadow across the cobalt waters of the lake, we returned to our sky-blue reality. The Beetle sat waiting for us, its dirt-streaked curves looking absurdly modern and tragically fragile against the backdrop of the ancient Maya world. "We have a problem, Ennie," I noted, unlatching my passenger door. "Our current musical clutch, while charming in a folk horror sort of way, is losing its tune. My internal sensors detect a slackening of the tension on the G string. I calculate a 60% probability that we will be unable to shift into second gear before we reach the Salvadoran border." Ennie laughed, sliding behind the wheel and patting the metal dashboard. "Then we'll just have to retune the car, Mr. Twain. Maybe we can find a cello player in the next village, or maybe we just have to trust the machine." She turned the key. The engine erupted with its familiar deafening clatter, accompanied by a bright, resonant twang of the clutch. We pulled away from the lakeside, the reflection of the volcanoes shimmering in our rearview mirrors. "Trust," I muttered, settling back into my scalding, oil-scented seat as we began the steep climb out of the crater. A concept entirely unsupported by the laws of thermodynamics, but I suppose in a land where people weave the stars into their shirts, a car powered by a guitar string is almost sensible. The Pan-American Highway stretched out before us, a winding dark ribbon leading into the heart of Central America. We had a continent to conquer, a clutch to retune, and a story that was becoming increasingly melodic. Chapter 25. The Land of Volcanoes and Sardines. If Mexico City was a sprawling, multi-lane nightmare of urban expansion, El Salvador in 1968 was something far more intimate and claustrophobic. As we rattled across the border, yet another exercise in bureaucratic bewilderment, where I was briefly categorized as agricultural machinery. The landscape underwent a startling transformation. El Salvador is a pocket-sized nation of staggering verticality. It is a land where the earth seems to have been folded and crimped like a pastry crust, resulting in a dense concentration of volcanoes, coffee-draped hills, and human activity. Every square inch of fertile volcanic soil seemed to be occupied by a cornstalk, a coffee bush, or a brightly colored adobe house. "It's so packed, Mr. Twain!" Ennie shouted over the frantic rhythmic twang of our guitar string clutch. She was wrestling the Beetle through a narrow canyon of a road, flanked on both sides by a continuous stream of pedestrians, ox carts, and stray dogs. It's like the whole country is one big, vibrant neighborhood. Neighborhood is a polite euphemism, Ennie, I replied, my vocal gears grinding as I adjusted my acoustic projection. I was running my internal cooling fans at a weary hum, fighting the heavy, humid heat of the Pacific lowlands. I would characterize it as a state of industrialized sardine packing. I am currently calculating the population density and the probability of us navigating a 3-mile stretch of highway without encountering a localized festival, a poultry migration, or a mobile fruit stand is statistically 0. Our sky blue 1957 Beetle was currently performing with a peculiar melodic lethargy. The high tensile guitar strings that Ennie had so brilliantly braided to bridge the gap in our snapped clutch cable were suffering from a combination of tropical humidity and thermal expansion. What had once been a crisp G major twang upon shifting had degraded into a mournful flat D minor thrum. "The tension is slipping," Ennie muttered, her brow furrowed with professional concern. She wiped a fresh streak of grease and dust from her cheek. The steel core in these strings wasn't designed for a constant 300-pound pull in 90-degree weather. They're stretching, Mr. Twain. Every time I shift, I'm losing about a millimeter of throw. A millimeter of throw, I noted, is the difference between a functioning transaxle and a very expensive, very noisy paperweight. I suggest we locate a source of mechanical or musical supplies before our propulsion system achieves a state of permanent, melodic neutral. We limped into a bustling market town near the base of the Izalco volcano, the lighthouse of the Pacific. The streets were a vibrant, sweltering chaos of activity. The air was a thick, mouth-watering soup of wood smoke, roasting coffee, and the heavy, savory aroma of pupusas, thick, handmade corn tortillas stuffed with cheese and beans, sizzling on open griddles. The dominant force on the Salvadoran roads, however, were the buses. These were retired American school buses, resurrected and transformed into kaleidoscopic, chrome-plated chariots known as camionetas. They were painted in violent shades of neon pink, electric blue, and sunshine yellow, adorned with religious icons, chrome tassels, and names like La Reina del Camino or El Rayo de Esperanza. They moved with a terrifying high-speed grace, their air horns blaring a constant rhythmic warning. "Look at the art on those buses!" Ennie beamed, her eyes wide as a neon-green GMC bus roared past us, nearly taking off our side mirror. The chrome work, the hand-painted script, it's like a gallery on wheels, and they're running those engines on the absolute limit of their compression ratios. They are not galleries, Ennie. They are mobile, multi-colored death traps, I grumbled, venting a short pressurized hiss of steam from my mechanical cigar. I have observed 3 people sitting on the roof, 2 clinging to the rear ladder, and what appeared to be a crate of highly agitated iguanas wedged into the driver's side window. It is a masterpiece of overcapacity. We pulled the stuttering Beetle into the shade of a massive saber tree near the Central Market. Ennie killed the ignition, and the car let out a final musical ping of its failing clutch. "I need more wire," Ennie announced, hopping out of the car, "or at least some heavy-duty fencing clips to retention these strings." I unlatched my passenger door, my brass joints clicking, as I stepped onto the dusty street. I followed her into the heart of the market, my heavy copper boots hitting the ground with a definitive, ringing thud that caused a momentary silence to ripple through the nearby stalls. We found a small ferreteria, a hardware store that looked like it had been organized by a hurricane. It was a ceiling-to-floor jumble of rusted machetes, galvanized buckets, coils of baling wire, and bags of concrete. The proprietor, a man with a deeply lined face and a pair of thick, wire-rimmed spectacles, looked up as we entered. He stared at my brass lapels, my glowing vacuum tubes, and the steam perpetually venting from my cigar. "Buenas tardes," the man whispered, his eyes widening. "Is the señor for sale, or is he a new type of coffee-roasting machine?" "I assure you, sir," I drawled, projecting my voice with a crisp, aristocratic resonance, "I do not roast coffee, though I have been told my temperament is occasionally just as bitter. I am Mark Twain, an analytical, steam-powered marvel of literature and logic, and we are in desperate need of a specific variety of high-tensile wire." Ennie spent the next 20 minutes in a spirited negotiation involving a pair of calipers and a coil of high-grade galvanized fence wire. She eventually emerged with a heavy spool and a handful of steel U-bolts, looking as triumphant as if she had discovered gold. "This will do it," she cheered, as we walked back toward the car, stopping to buy a stack of fresh, hot pupusas from a vendor on the corner. We sat on the front bumper of the Beetle. The mechanical man and the optimist assimilated into the twilight ritual of El Salvador. Ennie happily consumed her pupusas, while I watched the volcanoes fade into purple silhouettes against a bruised tropical sky. "You know, Mr. Twain," Ennie said, her voice soft against the distant blaring of bus horns, "this country is so small, but it feels so big because of the people. They're all moving, all building, all trying to fit as much life as they can into every little bit of space. It is a highly inefficient, yet undeniably vibrant social algorithm," I conceded, taking a slow, contemplative draw from my cigar. "But I suspect our life would be significantly easier if we didn't have to share every inch of the road with a crate of iguanas." Ennie laughed, stood up, and patted her pocket where her favorite wrench resided. "Tomorrow we retention the orchestra, and then we head for the mountains of Honduras. I hear the grades there are even steeper." "Then I suggest you eat another pupusa, Ennie," I sighed, looking at the failing guitar string clutch. "I suspect you're going to need the energy." Chapter 26. The Pine-Scented Purgatory. The transition from the sweltering volcanic claustrophobia of El Salvador into the rugged, pine-draped interior of Honduras was a geographical pivot of the highest order. One moment, we were navigating a humid sea of sugarcane and coffee. The next, the road began a violent, upward trajectory into a landscape that looked remarkably like a tropical interpretation of the Swiss Alps. We reached the border at El Amatillo, under a sky the color of a bruised plum. The crossing was a masterpiece of Central American bureaucracy, involving no fewer than 6 different rubber stamps. A heated debate over whether my brass chassis constituted heavy industrial equipment, and a small yapping dog that seemed personally offended by the steam venting from my cigar. "They finally let us through, Mr. Twain," Ennie cheered, her voice competing with the rhythmic, mournful thrum of our failing guitar string clutch. "Welcome to the land of mountains and pine trees." "I am delighted, Ennie," I replied, my vocal gears grinding with a dry, metallic resonance. I adjusted my optical focus, the brass irises clicking as they captured the shifting scenery. However, my internal barometers indicate that we are currently ascending into a region where the air is as thin as a politician's promise. I calculate a 60% probability that our air-cooled engine will achieve a state of permanent thermal exhaustion before we reach the capital. The Great Retuning. As the road twisted deeper into the Sierra de la Pataric, the musical clutch finally surrendered its tune. The high-tension guitar strings, which had served us so faithfully through the Guatemalan Highlands, had stretched beyond the point of melodic utility. Every time Ennie attempted to shift, the Beetle emitted a sound like a dying cello, followed by a sickening lurch of the transmission. We pulled onto a narrow, pine needle-covered shoulder near a mountain spring. The air was crisp, scented with resin and wood smoke, a refreshing departure from the oily humidity of the lowlands. "Right," Ennie said, popping the front trunk and retrieving the spool of galvanized fence wire we'd acquired in El Salvador. "Time to swap the strings for something a bit more industrial." "Observe, Mr. Twain," she muttered, crawling beneath the chassis with a pair of heavy-duty pliers. "I'm going to use the galvanized wire as the primary lead. It has a significantly higher tensile strength, roughly, approximately 70,000 pounds per square inch. Compared to the musical-grade steel, I'll use the U-bolts to create a permanent loop at the throw-out arm." I stood guard at the rear of the vehicle, my heavy copper boots sinking slightly into the soft mountain earth. I took a slow, highly pressurized draw from my mechanical cigar and exhaled a plume of white steam that mingled with the mountain mist. "You are essentially replacing a violin string with a piece of a cattle fence," I noted, my voice echoing off the granite cliffs. "It is a logical progression toward a completely agricultural vehicle. I suspect by the time we reach Panama, the car will be held together entirely by hemp rope and goat hides." "It's not a fence, it's a structural linkage," Ennie's voice echoed from the shadows beneath the car. "And it's going to hold all the way to the Andes. Just you watch." The road to Tegucigalpa. With the new Honduran clutch linkage installed, the Beetle felt suddenly dangerously responsive. There was no more melodic twang, only a sharp mechanical snick as the gears engaged. We resumed our climb toward Tegucigalpa, the capital city that seemed to have been spilled haphazardly over a series of steep, pine-covered hills. The highway was a series of dizzying switchbacks, offering glimpses into deep, emerald valleys, where whitewashed villages clung to the slopes like patches of lichen. Scenery, soaring pines, jagged granite, and mountain mists. Climate, cool, crisp, and surprisingly dry. Mechanical status, clutch responsive, carburetor adjusted for altitude, coffee tin heater rattling rhythmically. "You have to admit, Ennie," I mused as we crested a final ridge, revealing the sprawling, multicolored chaos of the capital below. "The geography of this continent possesses a certain dramatic flair. It refuses to be boring." "That's because it's alive, Mr. Twain." Ennie smiled, her grease-smudged face radiant in the fading light. "It's not just a road, it's an adventure, and the bug is just getting started." I adjusted my bowler hat, my brass joints clicking in the cool mountain air. The Pan-American Highway had tried to snap our cables and choke our engines, but the mechanical man and the optimist were still moving south, one galvanized wire at a time. Chapter 27. The Vertical Labyrinth of Tegucigalpa. If El Salvador was a sardine can, Tegucigalpa in 1968 was a bowl of multicolored marbles dropped into a deep, jagged mountain crevice. The capital of Honduras does not possess a layout in any conventional Euclidean sense. It is a vertical sprawl of whitewashed adobe, crumbling stone, and vibrant neon, all clinging to the sides of steep, pine-shrouded hills with a desperation that defies the laws of urban planning. As our sky-blue 1957 Volkswagen Beetle rattled into the city limits, the road simply gave up the pretense of being horizontal. We were immediately plunged into a series of streets that felt less like thoroughfares and more like paved waterfalls. "Ennie," I stated, my vocal gears grinding with a dry metallic resonance. I braced my heavy copper arms against the painted metal dashboard as we descended a grade so steep that my internal gyroscopes were reporting a localized gravitational anomaly. I am currently calculating the coefficient of static friction between our tires and these ancient, oil-slicked cobblestones. The mathematics suggest that we are not driving so much as we are falling with style. "Oh, the bug is fine, Mr. Twain," Ennie cheered, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. She stood on the brake pedal. The scent of hot friction material, a pungent, acrid aroma of toasted brake shoes, filled the cabin. The new galvanized clutch linkage is holding up beautifully. I can feel every gear engage with a satisfying thunk. The thunk is the sound of our transmission screaming for a vacation, I countered, venting a short pressurized hiss of steam from my mechanical cigar. The architecture of vertigo. We navigated the Beetle through the Barrio La Leona, a historic district of narrow, winding alleys and grand, decaying colonial mansions. The streets were so tight that I was forced to retract my external steam-venting nozzles to avoid clipping the wrought iron balconies that leaned over us like curious, metallic spectators. The incline. Many streets in Tegucigalpa exceed a 25% grade requiring constant use of first gear and prayer. The surface, a treacherous mixture of 18th century cobblestones and 20th century asphalt patches. The obstacles, pedestrians, stray dogs, and the ever-present camionetas, brightly painted buses, that move through the narrow gaps with the grace of a charging rhino. We eventually found ourselves in the Plaza Morazan, the heart of the city. The twin towers of the Metropolitan Cathedral rose above the square, their white facades gleaming in the thin, high-altitude sun. The plaza was a swirling kaleidoscope of Honduran life. Vendors selling roasted corn and baleadas, flour tortillas stuffed with beans and cream, businessmen in sharp suits dodging shoe-shine boys, and the constant rhythmic shouting of market criers. The high-altitude market. Ennie killed the ignition near the Mercado San Isidro, and the Beetle let out a final thermal sigh of relief. The engine block, already stressed by the thin mountain air, ticked loudly as it began to shed its misery. "I need to check the oil," Ennie announced, hopping out of the car, "and I think I smell something delicious. We're in the land of the baleada, Mr. Twain. We have to sample the local engineering." We spent the afternoon wandering through the labyrinthine stalls of the market. It was a sensory overload of the highest order. The air was a thick, intoxicating soup of freshly roasted coffee beans from the surrounding hills. Piles of tropical fruit, mangoes, papayas, and the ubiquitous bananas. Toasted corn and sizzling pork from the open-air griddles. The sharp, resinous scent of pine needles used as floor coverings in some stalls. I stood in the center of a narrow alley, my heavy copper boots hitting the ground with a definitive ringing clank. I took a slow, highly pressurized draw from my cigar and exhaled a long, straight column of white steam that rose toward the corrugated tin roof. "Observe, Ennie," I drawled, projecting my voice over the din of the market. "This is a masterpiece of informal commerce. There is no central planning here, no bureaucratic oversight. Yet every stall functions with a ruthless organic efficiency. It is a localized analytical engine, processing the needs of a city using nothing but barter, grit, and the occasional bribe." Ennie laughed, her grease-smudged face radiant as she handed a few lempiras to a woman for a massive steaming baleada. She took a bite, her eyes closing in culinary bliss. "It's perfect, Mr. Twain," she mumbled. "Simple, sturdy, and reliable, exactly like a good engine." The descent. As the sun began to dip behind the peaks of El Picacho, casting long violet shadows across the valley, we returned to our sky-blue reality. The Beetle sat waiting for us, its dirt-streaked curves looking absurdly modern against the backdrop of the ancient mountain city. "Next stop, Nicaragua," Ennie said, wiping a fresh streak of oil onto her jumpsuit. "I hear the road across the border is a bit spirited. And there are more volcanoes." "Spirited is a term I would reserve for a particularly aggressive ghost," I sighed, unlatching my passenger door. "I suspect the road will be a repetitive, bone-jarring assault on my metallurgy. But for tonight, my dear mechanic, let us enjoy the fact that we are currently stationary and not currently tumbling down a 1-to-4 incline." Ennie smiled, slammed the engine deck lid shut, and looked toward the south. The Pan-American Highway was calling us back to the world of movement and vibration, and I had a feeling the 1957 Beetle was about to be tested like never before. Chapter 28. The Shimmering Plains of Nicaragua. The descent from the pine-scented altitudes of Honduras into the sprawling volcanic lowlands of Nicaragua was like moving from a refrigerator into a preheated iron skillet. As our sky-blue 1957 Volkswagen Beetle rattled across the border at El Espino, the geography performed a sudden, dramatic collapse. The rugged granite peaks and cool mountain mists were violently replaced by a vast, shimmering plain of heat-blasted scrub and ancient, fertile dust. The border crossing itself was a masterpiece of 1968 Central American theater. A line of soldiers in olive-drab fatigues watched with weary suspicion as I stepped out of the car, my brass joints clanking in the sweltering heat. I was briefly accused of being a subversive radio broadcast tower, a charge only dropped after Ennie demonstrated my complete lack of an antenna and my profound ability to complain about the humidity in 3 different languages. "We're officially in the land of lakes and volcanoes, Mr. Twain." Ennie cheered, her voice competing with the rhythmic, industrial snick of our new galvanized clutch linkage. She had the windows rolled all the way down, the hot, dry wind whipping her hair into a chaotic nest of curls. "I am acutely aware of our location, Ennie," I replied, my vocal gears grinding. I adjusted my optical focus, the brass irises clicking as they captured the horizon. My internal thermometers are currently reporting a temperature that suggests the Earth's crust is merely a suggestion in this region. I calculate a 92% probability that if we stop moving, we shall be permanently fused to the asphalt like a pair of discarded copper pennies. The Maribio's Chain. As we pushed toward the colonial city of León, the horizon was dominated by the Cordillera de los Maribios, a jagged, terrifyingly symmetrical line of volcanoes that rose from the flat plains like the teeth of a prehistoric beast. The most prominent among them, Momotombo, vented a lazy, constant plume of white smoke into the bruised indigo sky. Atmospheric conditions: 38 degrees Celsius with 85% humidity. Engine performance: the air-cooled Flat 4 was running lean and mean thanks to Ennie's high-altitude adjustments in Tegucigalpa, but the oil temperature was flirting with the red line. The spirited road. The highway was a patchwork of sun-baked asphalt and sudden deep ruts that sent violent vibrations through my chassis. "Observe the volcanoes, Ennie," I drawled, projecting my voice over the deafening rattle of the Beetle. They are the ultimate mechanical entities. They possess a primary boiler, a complex network of high-pressure conduits, and an absolute unyielding disregard for the puny structures humans build at their feet. They are the only things on this continent that I truly respect. They do not require spare parts, and they never apologize for their exhaust. The Soul of León. We rattled into the narrow, sun-drenched streets of León just as the afternoon sun was turning the city's whitewashed walls into a blinding golden glare. León in 1968 was a city of poets, revolutionaries, and deep colonial shadows. It felt heavier than Tegucigalpa, more rooted in its history, its stones saturated with centuries of intellectual fervor and religious devotion. We pulled the gasping Beetle into the shadow of the Cathedral of the Assumption, the largest cathedral in Central America. Its massive, weathered walls seemed to vibrate with the low, resonant tolling of its bells. "The architecture here," Ennie whispered, hopping out of the car and wiping a fresh layer of Nicaraguan dust from her cheek. "It's different. It's not just stone. It's like the buildings are holding their breath." "That is because they are waiting for the next earthquake or the next revolution, whichever comes first," I noted, unlatching my passenger door with a metallic scree clack. I stepped onto the ancient pavement, my heavy copper boots ringing like a struck anvil. We spent the evening wandering past the home of the poet Rubén Darío. I stood before his monument, the amber light of my vacuum tubes glowing behind my ribs as I processed his verses. "A poet, Ennie?" I sighed, venting a long, straight column of steam into the humid night. "A man who attempted to find order in the chaos of the human heart, using nothing but rhythm and rhyme. A noble, if entirely inefficient endeavor. He would have appreciated our Beetle. It is essentially a very loud, very greasy stanza in a poem that neither of us knows the ending to." Ennie smiled, leaning against the warm stone of a colonial archway. "Maybe the ending is just, 'Keep driving, Mr. Twain.'" Mechanical checkup. Before we retired for the night, Ennie performed a quick torch-lit inspection of our Honduran clutch. Galvanized wire, holding steady, minor stretching noted but corrected with a U-bolt adjustment. Coffee tin heater, rattling significantly, Ennie secured it with a fresh wrap of baling wire. Oil level, acceptable, though the viscosity was beginning to resemble warm molasses. "Tomorrow, we head for Managua and the Great Lake," Ennie announced, patting the Beetle's hood. "I hear the road follows the water for miles." "Then I suggest we check our flotation devices," I grumbled, looking toward the dark, looming silhouette of the volcanoes. I have no desire to test the buoyancy of brass. Chapter 29. The Steam-Powered Shoreline. The transition from the colonial shadows of Leon to the shimmering geothermal basin of Managua was less of a drive and more of a slow-motion immersion into a pressurized boiler. Nicaragua, in 1968, was a land defined by the violent tectonic marriage of water and fire, and as our sky-blue 1957 Volkswagen Beetle rattled along the shores of Lake Managua, Xolotlan, the atmosphere achieved a level of saturated, volcanic humidity that I found entirely offensive to my brass constitution. To my left, the lake stretched out like a sheet of hammered lead, its surface occasionally broken by the dark, brooding silhouette of the Momotombo volcano. To my right, the road was flanked by steam vents and bubbling mud pots that hissed with a rhythmic, subterranean malice. The humidity crisis. Inside the cabin, the environment had reached a point of thermal equilibrium that I can only describe as soup-like. My internal cooling fans were whining at a pitch that suggested they were considering immediate resignation. "Ennie?" I rasped, my vocal gears vibrating with the effort of projecting through the thick air. "I am currently recording an ambient humidity level of 94%. My internal vacuum tubes are beginning to resemble glowing pickles in a jar of hot brine. If we do not reach the capital soon, I calculate that my logic boards will spontaneously generate a localized moss colony." Ennie, however, was in her element. She sat behind the wheel, her grease-smudged face glowing with a mixture of perspiration and genuine, unkillable excitement. "Don't you see, Mr. Twain? It's free energy!" she cheered, gesturing toward a nearby steam vent that was violently geysering a plume of white vapor into the sky. "The whole Earth is a steam engine here. We're not just driving, we're navigating a planetary power plant." "It is a power plant that lacks a functioning exhaust system," I countered, venting a long pressurized column of steam from my mechanical cigar. My own vapor mingled with the volcanic mist, creating a localized fog bank that momentarily obscured the windshield. "I feel as though I am being personally insulted by the geology of this country." Managua, the city of lights and mud. We rattled into Managua just as the late afternoon sun began to dip behind the mountains, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and bruised orange. In 1968, Managua was a vibrant, sprawling metropolis, unaware that its architectural destiny would be violently rewritten by the earth just a few years later. The city was a fascinating, chaotic blend of modern concrete buildings, bustling markets, and grand lakeside promenades. The traffic, a dense honking swarm of vochos, fellow Beetles, American station wagons, and the ever-present brightly painted buses. The scent, a thick, heavy mixture of wood smoke, lake water, and the omnipresent sulphurous tang of geothermal activity. The sound, a continuous rhythmic wall of marimba music drifting from the lakeside bars, competing with the frantic clatter of our air-cooled engine. We pulled the Beetle to a halt near the Palacio Nacional, the engine did not so much stop as it gave a final, gasping pop hiss of thermal relief. "The galvanized clutch is still holding," Ennie announced, hopping out of the car and wiping a fresh layer of Nicaraguan dust from her brow. She patted the hood affectionately. "But she's hot, Mr. Twain. Really hot. The oil is basically water at this point." A meeting of steam. As I stepped out onto the sidewalk, my heavy copper boots ringing with a definitive clank, I found myself face to face with a group of local engineers who were monitoring a nearby geothermal tap. They were men of practical science, carrying heavy brass gauges and wearing stained khakis. They stopped their work, staring in absolute paralyzed silence at my brass lapels, my glowing vacuum tubes, and the steam perpetually venting from my jaw. "Buenas tardes, señores," I drawled, projecting my voice with a crisp, aristocratic resonance. "I observe that you are attempting to harness the unruly temper of this planet. As a fellow steam-powered entity, I can offer you two pieces of advice. Never trust a pressure gauge that hasn't been calibrated this morning, and always carry a spare set of baling wire." The engineers exchanged bewildered glances, but then the oldest among them smiled, raising his gauge in a silent professional salute. "You see, Ennie," I mused as we walked toward a nearby cafe, "even in the heart of a volcanic basin, the brotherhood of the boiler endures. Now please find me a place where I can sit in the shade and allow my rivets to contract. I believe I have expanded by several millimeters since we left Leon." Chapter 30. The Cloud Forest Ascent. The transition from the scorched, volcanic plains of Nicaragua to the verdant vertical embrace of Costa Rica was a geographical shock to my primary logic boards. We crossed the border at Peñas Blancas, under a sky that had abandoned its bruised, dusty violet for a deep, saturated indigo. In the year 1968, Costa Rica felt like a different planet, a sanctuary of staggering biological density, where the mountains didn't just rise, they erupted in a riot of emerald green. Our sky-blue 1957 Volkswagen Beetle, now held together by a combination of German engineering, Salvadoran fence wire, and pure, unadulterated luck, groaned as we began the long, winding climb toward the Cordillera Central. The biological excess. As we ascended, the dry scrub of the lowlands surrendered to the cloud forest. This was an environment of such profound dripping moisture that I was forced to engage my secondary brass gaskets to prevent a systemic short circuit. Atmospheric humidity, fluctuating between 96% and 100% saturation. Visibility, reduced to 20 feet by a thick, aromatic mist that tasted of moss and ancient rain. The scent, a heavy, intoxicating mixture of blooming orchids, rotting vegetation, and the faint, constant tang of our overheated engine oil. "Ennie," I rasped, my vocal gears grinding with a damp resonance. I adjusted my optical lenses, the brass irises clicking as they struggled to find a solid surface in the fog. "I am currently recording a level of biological activity that I find personally insulting. Every square inch of this topography is covered in something that is either growing, blooming, or actively attempting to digest our upholstery. It is a masterpiece of messy, organic inefficiency." Ennie, however, was practically vibrating with excitement. She had her head tilted out the window, ignoring the mist that was turning her hair into a chaotic, frizzy halo. It's a living machine, Mr. Twain. Look at the epiphytes on those branches. They're hydraulic systems for the canopy. And the bug is handling these steep, slick grades like she was born for them. The galvanized clutch linkage is providing excellent torque transfer on the shifts. The Inter-American Struggle. The road, a narrow ribbon of the Pan-American Highway, was a treacherous sequence of hairpin turns and sudden muddy washouts. We were sharing the path with ox carts, beautifully painted, traditional carretas that moved with a slow, rhythmic dignity. Coffee trucks, massive, groaning vehicles carrying the wealth of the highlands toward the ports. Wildlife, the occasional coatimundi or brilliant quetzal bird that seemed entirely unimpressed by our air-cooled clatter. Suddenly, a loud, metallic snap-twang echoed through the floorboards. The car lurched, and the engine roared in a vacuum of neutral. "The fence wire!" I barked, venting a massive plume of steam from my mechanical cigar. "I told you that agricultural hardware was a temporary delusion." "It's not the wire," Ennie yelled, already manhandling the Beetle toward a narrow, mossy turnout. "The wire is fine. It's the adjustment nut. The vibration must have rattled it right off the thread." Mechanical triage in the mist. We sat on the side of a mountain, surrounded by towering ferns and the distant haunting cry of a howler monkey. Ennie was once again flat on her back in the mud, her flashlight cutting through the swirling fog as she worked beneath the car. I stood guard, my heavy copper boots sinking into the soft, volcanic earth. I took a slow, highly pressurized draw from my cigar, the tip glowing red in the gloom. "Observe the irony, Ennie," I drawled, my voice echoing off the moss-covered cliffs. "We have conquered deserts, volcanoes, and international bureaucracies, only to be defeated by a 3-cent piece of threaded steel. It is a perfect metaphor for the human condition, tripped up by the trivial while staring at the sublime." "Found it!" she shouted from the shadows. "It was wedged in the heat exchanger. I just need a bit of baling wire to safety lock it this time." Within 20 minutes, she emerged, covered in a fresh layer of Costa Rican mud and looking absolutely triumphant. She wiped her hands on her jumpsuit and beamed at me. "We're back in business, Mr. Twain. Next stop, San Jose." Chapter 31. The Grano de Oro. The descent from the dripping emerald verticality of the cloud forests into the Valle Central felt like a transition from a prehistoric terrarium into a meticulously manicured Victorian parlor. As our sky-blue 1957 Volkswagen Beetle rattled toward the outskirts of San Jose, the suffocating humidity of the peaks surrendered to a crisp, temperate clarity that my internal sensors found almost suspiciously pleasant. San Jose in 1968 was a city possessing a distinct, caffeinated dignity. It was a metropolis built on the Grano de Oro, the golden bean, and the wealth of the surrounding coffee plantations was etched into every ornate cornice and wrought iron gate. The National Theater, a steampunk's approval. We navigated the Beetle through the narrow, bustling streets of the city center, the engine emitting a crisp, high-altitude chatter. Ennie steered us toward the Plaza de la Cultura, pulling to a stop directly in front of the Teatro Nacional. I unlatched my passenger door with a heavy metallic scree-clack. I stepped onto the pavement, my copper boots hitting the stone with a resonance that drew the attention of several well-dressed pedestrians. I adjusted my bowler hat, took a slow, highly pressurized draw from my mechanical cigar, and looked up at the facade. "Now this, Ennie," I drawled, my vocal gears smoothing into a low, appreciative baritone, "is an architectural apology for the last 500 miles of mud and ruts. It is a piece of Renaissance Europe that has inexplicably found itself residing in the tropics. It possesses a structural integrity that suggests its builders actually intended for it to exist in the next century." Ennie hopped out, her grease-smudged face radiant even under a layer of road dust. She leaned against the Beetle, looking up at the statues of Calderón de la Barca and Beethoven. "It's beautiful, Mr. Twain, but look at the streetlights. They're using early-model electric filaments. The grid integration in this city is decades ahead of the rural districts we just crossed." The coffee ritual. We spent the afternoon in a small wood-paneled cafe overlooking the plaza, while Ennie enthusiastically consumed a plate of gallo pinto and a cup of the local high-altitude roast. I sat rigidly, observing the social machinery of the capital. The atmosphere, polished mahogany, brass rails, and the intoxicating heavy aroma of dark roast coffee. The people, a sophisticated mix of coffee barons, university students, and tourists, all moving with a patient civil service-like efficiency. The sound, the rhythmic clink of porcelain spoons against saucers, providing a much-needed respite from the frantic clatter of our flat-4 engine. "Coffee, Mr. Twain," Ennie mused, blowing steam off her cup. "It's the fuel of civilization. Without this stuff, I don't think half the machines in the world would ever get designed, much less fixed." "It is a liquid delusion of productivity, Ennie," I countered, venting a short pressurized hiss of steam. "It grants humans the temporary sensation of being as efficient as a well-oiled gear, while in reality they are merely vibrating at a slightly higher frequency. However, I will concede that the aroma is a vast improvement over vaporized 30-weight motor oil." Mechanical status. San Jose checkpoint. Before we prepared for the final push toward the Panamanian border and the dreaded Darién Gap, Ennie performed a thorough inspection of our Honduran-Salvadoran hybrid systems. Component. Status. Observation. Clutch linkage. Secure. Galvanized fence wire holding. Safety locked with baling wire. Brake shoes. Worn. Significant thinning from the mountain descents. Adjustments made. Heater duct. Toxic. The dryer ducting is fraying. Ennie patched it with a discarded coffee tin. Engine oil. Replaced. Swapped for a heavier weight to combat the tropical heat. "We're solid for now," Ennie announced, slamming the rear deck lid shut with a triumphant clang. "But the road south of here, the Cerro de la Muerte, is the highest point on the Pan-American Highway. 11,000 feet, Mr. Twain. It's called the Mountain of Death for a reason." "A charming nomenclature," I sighed, looking toward the dark cloud-shrouded peaks on the horizon. "I suspect my logic boards will have much to say regarding the naming conventions of Costa Rican geography. Lead on, my dear mechanic. Let us see if we can cheat death one more time." Chapter 32. Cerro de la Muerte. There is a particular brand of irony favored by the Costa Rican cartographers of the mid-20th century. They have taken the highest, most treacherous stretch of the Pan-American Highway, a place where the earth literally scrapes the belly of the heavens, and christened it Cerro de la Muerte, the Mountain of Death. In the year 1968, as our sky-blue 1957 Volkswagen Beetle began its agonizing vertical crawl toward the summit, I found the nomenclature to be refreshingly honest. Most geographical labels are designed to deceive the traveler with promises of sunshine valleys or pleasant ridges, but the Ticos have seen fit to provide a spoiler for the impending catastrophe. The thin air crisis. As we surpass the 8,000-foot mark, the tropical lushness of the Central Valley vanished, replaced by a bleak, wind-scoured paramo of stunted shrubs and jagged volcanic rock. The atmosphere had achieved a level of structural fragility that I found personally insulting to my internal boiler. Altitude approaching 11,322 feet, 3,451 meters. Atmospheric pressure approximately 9.7 pounds per square inch. Roughly 65% of sea level pressure. Engine status. The air-cooled flat four was no longer an engine. It was a rhythmic metal sob. It was gasping for oxygen that simply wasn't there. "Ennie!" I rasped, my vocal gears grinding as I adjusted my draft to keep my firebox from suffocating. "I am currently recording a localized vacuum. Our propulsion system has transitioned from a combustion cycle to a series of optimistic hiccups. I calculate a 94% probability that if a particularly large butterfly lands on the front bumper, our forward momentum will be permanently reversed." Ennie, hunched over the wheel with her face inches from the frosted glass, was in a state of fierce mechanical concentration. Her sleeves were rolled down against the biting alpine chill, and she was feathering the throttle with a sensitivity that bordered on the psychic. "She's fine, Mr. Twain. She's just light-headed," Ennie shouted over the ragged, wheezing idle. "I've got the mixture leaned out so far the carburetor is basically running on the memory of gasoline. We just have to keep the RPMs up." The whiteout. Then came the fog. It was not the gentle, romantic mist of the cloud forests. It was a thick, opaque wall of freezing condensation that swallowed the road whole. Visibility dropped to approximately 4 feet, exactly the distance between my glass lens eyes and the Volkswagen's trunk handle. Suddenly, a violent hiss-pop echoed from the rear, and the Beetle shuddered as if it had been kicked by a mule. The car lurched, the engine sputtered, and we began to lose speed on a 15% grade. "Ice!" Ennie yelled, already manhandling the steering wheel, as we drifted toward the invisible edge of the precipice. The moisture in the intake is flash freezing in the venturi. The carburetor is choking on its own breath. The thermal intervention. We rolled to a stop in a world that had ceased to have a horizontal axis. We were suspended in a white, freezing void. Ennie didn't even wait for the handbrake. She threw open her door and vanished into the fog. I unlatched my passenger door, my brass joints screaming as the freezing mountain air hit my heated copper plating. I trudged to the rear, where Ennie was frantically trying to clear the ice from the intake with a screwdriver. "It's too cold, Mr. Twain. The exhaust heat isn't enough at this speed." I looked at the frozen mechanism, then at my own internal pressure gauge. I adjusted a series of brass valves on my ribs, feeling the scalding high-pressure steam build behind my copper chest plate. "Ennie," I drawled, the sound of my voice muffled by the fog. "Step aside. I am about to perform a localized environmental correction. I leaned over the engine bay, positioned my mechanical cigar directly over the frozen carburetor, and opened the primary bypass valve. A violent, shrieking jet of superheated high-pressure steam erupted from my face, engulfing the engine in a white thermal cloud. The ice didn't just melt, it vanished. The metal of the intake manifold turned a dull, warm gray. "Start it!" I barked. Ennie dove into the cab and twisted the key. The starter whined, the engine coughed out a plume of vapor, and then, with a defiant high-altitude roar, it caught fire. The idle was crisp and steady. The descent of the dead. We spent the next 2 hours descending the southern face of the mountain, our brakes emitting a faint blue smoke as they fought the weight of our brass and steel carriage. By the time the fog broke and revealed the lush, humid lowlands leading toward the Panamanian border, my internal logic boards were finally beginning to reboot. Mechanical casualty. One secondary steam gasket, slightly warped. Improvement. Ennie reinforced the heater duct with a piece of heavy canvas she found in the trunk. Outlook. The mountain of death had been conquered by a combination of German resilience and Victorian thermodynamics. "Well, Mr. Twain," Ennie smiled, her grease-smudged face radiant as the temperature began to climb back into the 90s. "We're still alive. And look, the sign says Panama, 50 kilometers. I am officially striking the word death from my vocabulary, I sighed, venting a long, satisfied plume of steam. From now on, I shall refer to that peak as Twain's Folly. Now, please, find us a road that doesn't involve the stratosphere. I believe my rivets are finally returning to their original dimensions." Chapter 33. The Isthmus and the Incision. If the mountain of death was a vertical assault on our structural integrity, the descent into Panama was a horizontal immersion into a planetary steam room. We crossed the border at Paso Canoas under a sun that seemed to have abandoned all pretense of benevolence, opting instead for a localized policy of total thermal annihilation. Panama in 1968 was a narrow, vibrant bottleneck of global commerce, a slender thread of Earth struggling to hold two continents together, while being systematically bisected by the ambitions of men. As our sky-blue 1957 Volkswagen Beetle rattled along the final stretch of the Inter-American Highway, the atmosphere achieved a level of liquid air that I found personally insulting to my internal brass gaskets. The tropical stagnation. The geography here had flattened into a lush, suffocating expanse of banana plantations, dense mangroves, and roadside stalls selling chilled coconuts. Ambient temperature, 36 degrees Celsius, 97 degrees Fahrenheit. Relative humidity, 98%. Mechanical status. The Honduran galvanized clutch was performing with a rhythmic metallic snick, though the engine oil had achieved the consistency of warm tea. "Ennie," I rasped, my vocal gears vibrating with a damp metallic resonance. I adjusted my optical focus, my brass irises clicking as they captured the shimmering heat waves. "I am currently recording a localized atmospheric failure. The oxygen in this region has been entirely displaced by warm, briny water. I calculate a 96% probability that if we don't reach the canal zone soon, my logic boards will simply surrender and begin a new life as a decorative coral reef." Ennie, whose grease-smudged face was currently a mask of sheer, focused perspiration, merely wiped her brow and threw the Beetle into fourth gear. "It's not failure, Mr. Twain. It's efficiency. The humidity acts as a natural coolant for the exterior of the block. We just have to keep the air moving." The Bridge of the Americas. As we approached the Panama Canal, the horizon was dominated by a colossal silver arc of steel, the Bridge of the Americas. Completed only 6 years prior in 1962, it stood as a soaring four-lane monument to the victory of engineering over geography. We began the long, sweeping ascent onto the bridge. To our left, the Pacific Ocean stretched out in a blinding silver glare. Below us, the canal itself appeared as a precise, surgical incision across the face of the earth, a narrow ribbon of water through which the massive, rusted hulls of cargo ships moved with a slow, planetary dignity. Height above water, 61 meters, 201 feet. Length, 1,654 meters, 5,425 feet. Twain's observation: "Observe the arrogance of the species, Ennie. They spent decades and thousands of lives to cut a hole through a continent, and then spent millions more to build a silver ladder so they wouldn't have to look at the hole they made." The hydraulic marvel. Ennie brought the Beetle to a slow, shuddering halt at a scenic overlook near the Miraflores locks. We stood at the railing, the mechanical man and the optimist, watching a 10,000-ton freighter being lifted like a toy by the invisible hands of gravity and water. "It's the hydrostatic pressure, Mr. Twain," Ennie whispered, her voice devoid of its usual bounce, replaced by a hushed, mechanical reverence. She gestured toward the massive steel gates. "They aren't using pumps. They're just using the weight of the water from Lake Gatun. It's a closed-loop gravity engine on a continental scale. It's beautiful." "It is a remarkably efficient way to move a mountain of coal," I conceded, venting a long, pressurized plume of steam from my mechanical cigar. The white vapor mingled with the tropical haze. "But I suspect the original inhabitants of this isthmus would have preferred it if you just walked across the dirt. It is a masterpiece of invasive logic." The Darién shadow. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged, jungle-shrouded peaks of the interior, casting a long violet shadow across the canal, Ennie turned back toward the parked Beetle. Her expression, usually radiant with unkillable optimism, held a flicker of genuine concern. "The highway ends soon, Mr. Twain," she said softly, looking toward the east. The Darién Gap. No roads, no bridges. Just 200 miles of the thickest jungle on Earth between us and South America. "I am aware," I sighed, unlatching my passenger door. "I have already begun calculating the buoyancy of our chassis. I suspect our Honduran clutch is about to be tested by something far more formidable than a mountain grade. We are about to enter the only place on Earth where the Pan-American Highway simply gives up." Ennie smiled, the spark returning to her eyes as she patted the Beetle's hood. "Well, if the highway gives up, we'll just have to make our own." Chapter 34. Yaviza and the Great Interruption. The Pan-American Highway is a grand continental promise, a ribbon of asphalt intended to bind the frozen reaches of the Arctic to the wind-swept tip of Tierra del Fuego. But every promise has its breaking point, and in the year 1968, that point was a humid, muddy dead end in the eastern Panamanian jungle called Yaviza. We rolled into the village just as a tropical downpour began to turn the world into a gray vertical ocean. Our sky-blue 1957 Volkswagen Beetle, caked in the dust of 7 nations and held together by an increasingly elaborate network of baling wire and galvanized fencing, sputtered to a halt where the pavement simply stopped. Beyond the front bumper, there was no more road. There was only a wall of green so dense it seemed to possess its own gravitational pull, and a river of deep mahogany mud that had successfully defeated every engineering corps since the Spanish conquest. The statistics of impossibility. I unlatched my passenger door with a weary metallic scree-clack. I stepped out into the knee-deep sludge, my heavy copper boots sinking with a definitive wet thwack. I adjusted my bowler hat, took a slow, highly pressurized draw from my mechanical cigar, and looked into the abyss of the Darién Gap. "Ennie," I drawled, my vocal gears grinding with a damp, metallic resonance. "I am currently running a Monte Carlo simulation on our probability of traversing the next 200 miles of this gap using our current propulsion system. Given the soil density, the average annual rainfall, and the fact that our vehicle possesses the ground clearance of a discarded shoe, I have arrived at a final value. P, success, equals approximately 0.000042%. The remaining percentage is a calculation of our inevitable transformation into a very expensive, very mossy, artificial reef." Ennie, however, was already out of the car, her grease-smudged face glowing with a terrifying, unkillable optimism. She was peering into the jungle, her hands on her hips, seemingly unimpressed by the lack of a highway. "Oh, stop with the math, Mr. Twain," she shouted over the roar of the rain hitting our tin roof. "It's not a gap, it's a challenge. If they won't build a road, we'll just have to find a different way to move the machine." The Port of Desperation. Yaviza was a village defined by the Great Interruption. It was a chaotic frontier outpost of corrugated tin roofs, wooden walkways, and the constant rhythmic thrum of outboard motors. The economy. Built entirely on the fact that everyone reaches this point and realizes they are stuck. The sound. A cacophony of barking dogs, shouting traders, and the rushing water of the Chucunaque River. The sight. Massive dugout canoes, piraguas, laden with everything from crates of chickens to rusted sewing machines, navigating the brown swirling currents. We spent the afternoon negotiating with a man named Capitan Jorge, a weathered individual whose skin had the texture of an old fan belt and whose eyes suggested he had seen every mechanical failure known to man. He stood on a rotting wooden pier looking down at our Beetle with an expression of profound professional pity. "You want to put the vocho on my lancha?" Jorge asked, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. He looked at the galvanized fence wires securing our clutch and the coffee tin heater strapped to the exhaust. "The river is high, señorita. The jungle does not like cars. The jungle eats cars." "She's a light car, Jorge," Ennie argued, her voice full of persuasion. 1,500 pounds tops. If we can bridge the gap to a banana boat, we can sail around the gap to Colombia. The mechanical triage. While Ennie negotiated our passage, I performed a final pessimistic inspection of our international hybrid systems. Component, status, observation, Honduran clutch, stretched. The galvanized wire has achieved a permanent set, needs retentioning, chassis oxidized. The salt air of the coast has begun a systemic assault on our floorboards. Internal boiler, stable. My own steam pressure is holding, though the humidity is making my valves sticky. Logic boards, cynical. Currently recording a 100% saturation of absurdity. Well, Mr. Twain, Ennie smiled, returning to the car with a triumphant grin, we have a boat. Tomorrow, we load the bug onto a flat-bottomed barge and we head for the Caribbean. We're skipping the mud and taking the sea route to Cartagena. A boat, I sighed, venting a long pressurized plume of steam that rose toward the jungle canopy. We are transitioning from a terrestrial disaster to a nautical catastrophe. I have always found that water is merely a more creative way for the universe to drown a machine. But lead on, my dear mechanic. Let us see if our sky blue tin can possess any latent buoyancy. Chapter 35. The Nautical Gamble. To be a mechanical entity of steam and brass is to possess an inherent, well-founded distrust of any environment that cannot be properly grounded. Land is reliable. It offers friction, resistance, and a predictable geological foundation. Water, however, is a shimmering liquid treachery. It is a universal solvent dedicated to the slow, systematic oxidation of my structural integrity. As we prepared to load our sky blue 1957 Volkswagen Beetle onto a flat-bottomed wooden barge in the muddy shallows of the Chucunaque River, I found myself running a continuous diagnostic on my buoyancy compensators. The results were, as expected, dismal. The loading ritual. The barge was a sprawling, semi-buoyant platform of tropical hardwoods lashed together with vines and rusted cable, powered by a pair of screaming, oversized outboard motors that smelled of cheap oil and desperation. Capitan Jorge stood on the deck, gesturing with a hand that was missing 2 fingers toward a pair of narrow, suspiciously thin wooden planks connecting the pier to the vessel. "Ennie," I stated, my vocal gears vibrating with a high-frequency alarm. I adjusted my optical focus, my brass irises clicking as they measured the width of the planks. "I am currently calculating the load-bearing capacity of those timber spans. Given the weight of our vehicle, approximately 1,600 pounds in my own copper heavy frame, divided by approximately 450 pounds. The probability of those boards achieving a state of catastrophic structural failure is approximately 89.4%. Physics is just a suggestion if you move fast enough, Mr. Twain," Ennie shouted over the roar of the rain. She was already behind the wheel, the engine of the Beetle clattering with a frantic, nervous energy. She wiped a smudge of river mud from her forehead and grinned. "Line me up." I stood at the edge of the pier, serving as a hulking, steam-venting guidepost. "Observe, Jorge," I drawled to the captain as the Beetle's front tires touched the wood. "You are about to witness either a master class in precision driving or the most expensive splash in the history of the Darién. I suggest you ready your lifeboats, though I suspect I shall sink with the velocity of a discarded anvil." With a sudden, aggressive burst of throttle, Ennie launched the Beetle across the planks. The wood groaned, flexed, and emitted a terrifying crack. But the bug scurried across like a blue water strider, landing on the barge with a heavy metallic thud that caused the entire vessel to tilt alarmingly to the port side. The maritime lashing. Securing a motor vehicle to a shifting wooden deck in a tropical storm requires a level of improvisational engineering that would make a shipyard foreman weep. The problem: the Beetle's center of gravity was relatively high compared to the flat deck, risking a rollover in heavy swells. The solution: Ennie utilized the remaining spool of Honduran galvanized fence wire, threading it through the Beetle's jack points and anchoring it to the heavy timber ribs of the barge. "I'm creating a cross-tensioned web," Ennie explained, her hands moving with a blur of professional speed as she tightened the U-bolts. "The force of the tension should be enough to counteract the lateral acceleration of the waves. She's not going anywhere, Mr. Twain." "Unless the boat itself decides to relocate to the riverbed," I noted, unlatching my passenger door and stepping gingerly onto the vibrating deck. I took a slow, highly pressurized draw from my mechanical cigar and exhaled a plume of white steam that was instantly shredded by the wind. Into the Caribbean. As Capitan Jorge throttled the outboards, the barge slowly detached from the muddy banks of Yaviza. We began our slow, rhythmic crawl down the river toward the open sea. The jungle walls, thick, green, and indifferent, slowly pulled back, replaced by the vast, salt-slicked horizon of the Caribbean. The scent, a suffocating mixture of rotting mangroves, salt spray, and the acrid exhaust of the two-stroke motors. The sensation, a slow, nauseating roll that sent my internal gyroscopes into a state of continuous recalibration. The status: one sky blue Beetle, 2,000 miles from home, currently serving as the most unlikely cargo in the history of the Spanish Main. "We're doing it, Mr. Twain!" Ennie yelled, leaning against the Beetle's fender as the first salt spray hit the windshield. "We're skipping the gap. Colombia is just across that water." "We are currently a floating anomaly, Ennie," I sighed, adjusting my bowler hat as a wave crashed against the bow, dousing my brass shins in brine. "I have survived the Nevada desert and the mountain of death, but I suspect my biography will eventually conclude with the words, 'And then the salt water got him.' Drive on, Jorge, or sail on, whatever it is we are currently doing." Chapter 36. The Squall of the Spanish Main. The Caribbean Sea, while aesthetically pleasing in brochures, possesses a violent, bipolar temperament that I find entirely incompatible with my internal circuitry. We had been at sea for less than 6 hours, clinging to the deck of Capitan Jorge's barge like a pair of metallic barnacles, when the horizon simply vanished. The bruised tropical sky was replaced by a wall of slate-gray clouds that seemed to be actively seeking a confrontation with the ocean. The wind, previously a gentle, salt-scented breeze, transformed into a localized hurricane that whipped the sea into a frothing, white-capped frenzy. The physics of the slide. As the first massive swell hit the barge, the vessel tilted at an angle that my internal gyroscopes calculated to be approximately 22 degrees. I felt my heavy copper boots lose their purchase on the slick, waterlogged timber of the deck. Inside the Beetle, Ennie was white-knuckled, her face pressed against the glass as she watched the prow of the barge disappear beneath a wall of green water. The galvanized fence wire she had used to lash the car was singing a high-pitched, metallic scream of tension. "Ennie!" I shouted over the roar of the gale, my vocal gears grinding against the salt spray. "The lateral force, F sub L, acting on our chassis is currently exceeding the static friction mu sub S. of these wet wooden planks. If that forward lashing fails, we shall achieve a state of high-velocity aquatic deployment. F subsliding equals m times g times sine of theta minus mu sub s times m times g times cosine theta. The mathematics suggest we are currently one rogue wave away from becoming a very aerodynamic submarine. "The wire won't fail, Mr. Twain," she yelled back, throwing open her door and sliding out into the drenching rain. She was instantly soaked, her jumpsuit clinging to her frame, but she didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy iron pry bar and scrambled toward the front bumper. The waterproofing crisis. I, meanwhile, was experiencing a profound structural emergency. My primary brass plating is designed for the dry, dusty plains of Missouri, not the corrosive, high-pressure baptism of a Caribbean squall. The leak. Salt water was beginning to infiltrate the secondary gaskets of my left knee joint. The corrosion. I could practically feel the salt air initiating a microscopic systemic oxidation of my copper rivets. The steam. Every time a wave crashed over the deck, the cold water hit my heated boiler casing, resulting in a violent, blinding eruption of white vapor that made me look like a localized weather event. I am currently a high-pressure tea kettle in a washing machine, I grumbled, bracing my arms against the Beetle's roof to help stabilize the vehicle. I took a defiant, highly pressurized draw from my mechanical cigar, only for the tip to be extinguished by a stray gallon of seawater. The lashing restoration. Ennie was a blur of grease and grit. She reached the front anchor point just as the barge bucked again. The U-bolt holding the fence wire had begun to bite into the soft wood of the deck, threatening to tear free. She didn't use a wrench. She used the pry bar as a lever, physically heaving the slack out of the wire while the barge rolled. With a grunt of pure, unadulterated mechanical willpower, she hammered a fresh set of steel staples into the timber, pinning the wire in place. "There!" she panted, crawling back toward the cabin. "She's not moving an inch now. We just have to ride it out." The citadel of Cartagena. As suddenly as it had begun, the squall broke. The clouds tore open to reveal a bruised violet twilight, and the sea settled back into a rhythmic, exhausted swell. And there, emerging through the receding mist like a stone dream, were the massive, sun-bleached ramparts of Cartagena de Indias. The ancient Spanish walls, built to repel pirates and empires, rose from the water with a staggering colonial permanence. The sight, the dome of the San Pedro Claver Church glowing in the dying light. The sound, the distant rhythmic thrum of the Colombian coast. The status, one sky-blue beetle, salt-crusted and shivering, but officially on South American soil, or at least within sight of it. "We made it, Mr. Twain," Ennie whispered, leaning her head against the salt-streaked window. She looked exhausted, her hair matted with brine, but her smile was as bright as a new gear. South America, we're actually here. "I am currently 60% rust and 40% indignation," I sighed, venting a final weary plume of steam that rose toward the stars. "But I suppose I can postpone my structural collapse for one more continent. Drive on, Jorge. Bring us to the pier before I achieve a state of permanent mineralization." Chapter 37. The Gates of Cartagena. If the Caribbean Sea was a baptism by saltwater and high-velocity terror, then the unloading process in Cartagena de Indias was an exercise in slow-motion, gravitational suspense. As the barge nudged against the weathered stone quay of the old port, the sky-blue 1957 Volkswagen Beetle looked less like a transcontinental vehicle and more like a very large, very rounded block of salt. The Honduran galvanized clutch linkage emitted a sharp, rusty creak as Ennie depressed the pedal. The engine, having sat in a humid salt mist brine for 2 days, sputtered and wheezed before erupting into a cloud of white, sulphuric smoke. "She's alive, Mr. Twain!" Ennie cheered, her voice ringing out over the rhythmic calling of the dock workers. She was currently a chaotic tableau of dried sea salt, engine grease, and pure, unadulterated triumph. The salt-crusted reality. I unlatched my passenger door, the brass hinges screaming in a pitch that suggested they were currently being digested by oxidation. I stepped onto the solid, unmoving stones of South America, my heavy copper boots leaving white, salty footprints on the dark pavement. I adjusted my bowler hat, which had taken on a structural stiffness usually reserved for cast iron, and took a slow, highly pressurized draw from my mechanical cigar. "Ennie," I drawled, my vocal gears grinding with a dry metallic resonance, "I am currently recording a systemic failure of my aesthetic parameters. I feel as though I have been transformed into a very large, very grumpy tea kettle that has been abandoned at the bottom of a brine tank. I calculate a 94% probability that if I do not receive a thorough buffing with beeswax and high-grade oil within the hour, my primary joints will achieve a state of permanent geological fusion." Ennie laughed, already hopping out of the car to inspect the undercarriage. "Oh, we'll get you cleaned up, Mr. Twain, but look at where we are. This is the walled city. Pirates used to stare at these ramparts and turn around out of sheer intimidation." A colonial masterpiece. Cartagena, in 1968, was a city of deep, sun-drenched shadows and vibrant tropical colors. The Las Murallas, the massive stone walls built by the Spanish over 2 centuries, enclosed a labyrinth of narrow, cobbled streets lined with yellow and ochre houses. Every balcony seemed to be overflowing with bougainvillea in shades of violent pink and electric purple. The scent, a thick, intoxicating blend of dark roast coffee, frying arepas, sea salt, and ancient stone. The sound, the clatter of horse-drawn carriages, the rhythmic beat of cumbia music from a nearby cafe, and the distant, constant murmur of the Pacific and Caribbean tides meeting. The atmosphere, a palpable, heavy sense of history, as if the stones themselves were saturated with the stories of emeralds, gold, and the Inquisition. The South American assessment. Before we could begin the long vertical climb toward the Andes, Ennie insisted on a continental audit of our sky-blue reality. Component, status, observation, Honduran clutch, crusty. The galvanized wire is holding, but the salt has made the action gritty. Engine block, oxidized. A fine layer of salt crust covers the tins. Cooling efficiency is down by 12% dollars. Brake lines. Sensitive. The humidity has softened the pedal feel. Ennie suspects air in the lines. Mark Twain. Corroded. Joint mobility restricted. Humor levels at a record low. "We're going to need a day of maintenance," Ennie announced, patting the salt-streaked hood of the Beetle. "Fresh oil, a thorough wash, and I need to find some high-temp grease for your knee joints, Mr. Twain." "I shall accept your offer of grease, Ennie," I sighed, venting a long, weary plume of steam into the humid Colombian air. "But only if you promise that our next leg of the journey involves more mountains and significantly less salt spray. I have had enough of the ocean to last me until the next industrial revolution." Ennie smiled, looking through the massive stone gate of the clock tower toward the interior of the continent. "South America is all mountains, Mr. Twain. From here to the tip of the world, it's nothing but the Andes." "Then let us begin our vertical ascent," I muttered, my brass joints clicking as we rolled slowly into the heart of the city. I prefer my challenges to be made of granite, not brine. Chapter 38. The Emerald Ascent. The departure from the salt-bleached ramparts of Cartagena was less of a journey and more of a slow vertical extraction from a pressurized humidifier. To a creature of brass and copper, the Colombian coastline is a chemical battlefield. But as our sky-blue 1957 Volkswagen Beetle pointed its rounded nose toward the interior, the geography began to offer a different, more gravitational variety of hostility. We were leaving the Tierras Calientes, the hot lands, and beginning the long, winding climb toward the heart of the Antioquia region. The goal was Medellin, a city cradled in the Aburrá Valley, but between us and that temperate sanctuary lay 1,000 vertical meters of emerald green defiance. The thermodynamic reconciliation. Before the first major incline, Ennie insisted on a systemic desalinization. She had spent the morning scrubbing my brass joints with a mixture of lemon juice and high-grade mineral oil, a process that was as undignified as it was necessary. "There," she panted, wiping a fresh streak of Colombian road dust onto her already blackened jumpsuit. "Your knee servos aren't screaming anymore, Mr. Twain, and I've packed the wheel bearings with fresh grease. We're going to need every bit of lubrication for the Troncal del Caribe." "I am grateful for the structural restoration, Ennie," I drawled, my vocal gears finally free of the Caribbean grit. I adjusted my bowler hat and took a slow, highly pressurized draw from my mechanical cigar. "However, I am currently calculating the thermal load on our air-cooled Flat 4. We are attempting to move 2,000 pounds of metal and ego up a 30-degree incline in a climate that is essentially a localized steam bath. The physics are uncharitable." The vertical jungle. As the road began to twist, the coastal scrub vanished, replaced by a dense, suffocating wall of tropical greenery. This wasn't the dry heat of the Sonora. It was a lush, dripping environment where the very air seemed to be composed of 98% liquid. The grade, constant inclines ranging from 10% to 15%. The traffic, massive moolah trucks, lumbering chrome-plated Kenworths and Macs, belching thick black diesel smoke that coated our windshield in a greasy film. The mechanical strain our Honduran galvanized clutch linkage was holding, but the heat from the engine was beginning to transfer through the floorboards. "Observe the moolahs, Ennie," I noted, venting a plume of steam that mingled with the diesel haze. "They are the undisputed kings of this vertical labyrinth. They move with a slow planetary inevitableness, while we are merely a blue mosquito buzzing around their tailpipes. I suspect if one of them were to sneeze, our Volkswagen would be relocated to the bottom of the Magdalena River." The carburetor's lament. Halfway up the first major ridge, the Beetle began to exhibit a rhythmic asthmatic stutter. The engine, tuned for the sea-level oxygen of the coast, was finding the thinning Andean air to be a personal insult. Ennie didn't even wait for a shoulder. She pulled the staggering car halfway into a ditch, the rear end hanging precariously over a lush ravine, and hopped out with her screwdriver. "She's running too rich," Ennie shouted over the roar of a passing coffee truck. "The air density is dropping faster than I expected. I need to lean out the idle jet again." She worked with a frantic surgical precision, her hands moving inches from the scorching heat of the exhaust. Within minutes, she had the Solex carburetor adjusted to a mountain lean setting. The engine settled into a crisp, high-pitched chatter that sounded remarkably like a sewing machine on a caffeine binge. The City of Eternal Spring. As we crested the final pass, the sun began to dip behind the jagged violet peaks of the central Cordillera. Below us, twinkling like a spilled box of diamonds in the darkening valley, was Medellin. The transition was absolute. The suffocating weight of the coast was gone, replaced by a cool, temperate breeze that smelled of orchids and mountain rain. "We made it to the valley, Mr. Twain," Ennie whispered, her face lit by the golden glow of the dashboard. "The City of Eternal Spring." "A charming epithet," I sighed, feeling my internal rivets finally begin to contract in the cooler air. Though I suspect the city of vertical cobblestones might be more accurate. Still, Ennie, I believe my logic boards can find a temporary peace in this particular coordinates. Chapter 39. The City of Eternal Spring. The descent into the Aburrá Valley was a masterclass in atmospheric mercy. After the salt-slicked trauma of the Caribbean and the suffocating vertical humidity of the Colombian foothills, Medellin opened up before us like a botanical sanctuary. In the year 1968, the city was a vibrant red-tiled jewel cradled by mountains that seemed to have finally agreed to a ceasefire with the horizon. Our sky-blue 1957 Volkswagen Beetle, sporting a fresh coat of Andean dust over its salt-pitted fenders, coasted down the winding Las Palmas Road. The engine, previously a screaming air-cooled banshee, settled into a content, rhythmic purr in the temperate air. The thermodynamic relief. I sat in the passenger seat, my internal cooling fans finally slowing from their desperate high-pitched whine to a dignified low-frequency hum. My brass joints, recently lubricated with Ennie's Medellin Special, a mixture of mineral oil and a prayer, moved with a fluid grace I hadn't felt since the Nevada border. "Ennie," I drawled, my vocal gears resonating with a newfound clarity. I adjusted my optical focus, my brass irises clicking, as I took in the lush, orchid-draped balconies of the city. I am currently recording an ambient temperature of exactly 22 degrees Celsius. It is a climate of such profound mathematical perfection that I suspect the local meteorologists have simply retired out of sheer boredom. My internal boiler is operating at peak efficiency, a state I haven't achieved since the invention of the radiator. Ennie, her grease-smudged face finally free of the salt crust of the coast, laughed as she navigated the Beetle through the bustling streets of El Poblado. "It's the Newton's law of coolin' in action, Mr. Twain," she cheered. "The rate of heat loss is proportional to the difference in temperature between the engine and the environment. dt over dt equals minus k, open parenthesis, T sub-engine minus T sub-ambient, close parenthesis. With tea ambient dropping by 14 degrees, the bug's oil temperature is finally out of the danger zone. She feels like a brand new car. The sileteros and the wooden logic. As we approached the city center, the road was momentarily blocked by a procession of sileteros. These were local farmers from the mountain village of Santa Elena, carrying massive circular wooden frames on their backs, siletas piled high with a dizzying kaleidoscopic arrangement of lilies, carnations, sunflowers, and orchids. The weight. Some siletas weigh upwards of 70 kilograms, 154 pounds. The engineering. A simple but effective system of leather straps and wooden bracing designed to distribute the load across the human spine. The sight. A moving forest of color that turned the gray asphalt into a floral tapestry. I stood up in the passenger seat, as much as my heavy brass frame would allow, my glass lens eyes whirring as I analyzed the wooden structures. "Observe, Ennie," I noted, venting a small, appreciative puff of steam from my mechanical cigar. A masterpiece of organic logistics. These men are carrying the entire biological output of a mountain on their backs, using nothing but oak and gravity. It is a level of structural integrity that makes our German tin can look positively flippant. Ennie was transfixed, her eyes tracing the way the wooden slats were joined. "It's the same principle as our floorboards, Mr. Twain. Distributed load-bearing. I bet I could use that bracing technique to reinforce our rear luggage rack." The coffee axis preparation. We spent the evening in a small plaza near the Basilica Metropolitana, the Beetle parked under a flowering guaiacan tree. While Ennie performed a celebratory no-salt wash of the chassis, I sat on a stone bench, observing the social machinery of the valley. Component status, observation. Engine oil, stable. Viscosity holding. No longer resembles hot tea. Clutch, Honduran. Snug. Galvanized wire has settled into its new home, Twain's spirits. Improved. Sarcasm levels optimized. Rivets fully contracted. Next goal, E.J. Cafetero, the steep, wet hills of the coffee axis. Tomorrow, we head south toward Manizales and Pereira, Ennie announced, wiping a final streak of grime from the windshield. The coffee axis. It's going to be wet, it's going to be steep, and the roads are basically carved out of emeralds. Then I suggest we enjoy this eternal spring while it lasts, I sighed, looking up at the mountains that ring the valley like a velvet curtain. I suspect our next chapter involves a significant amount of rain and a return to my customary state of mechanical indignation. Ennie smiled, leaned against the fender, and watched the lights of Medellin begin to twinkle on the slopes. The Pan-American Highway was calling, but for one night, the machine and the man were at peace. Chapter 40. The Emerald Mist. Leaving the eternal spring of Medellin for the heart of the A.J. Cafetero, the coffee axis, was a transition from a manicured garden into a vertical, moss-covered labyrinth. As our sky-blue 1957 Volkswagen Beetle rattled southward toward Manizales, the central cordillera of the Andes decided to test our structural integrity with a series of inclines that defied the very concept of level ground. Manizales is a city that should not, by any reasonable law of urban planning, exist. It is perched precariously atop a jagged mountain ridge, its streets dropping away at angles that make a bobsled run look like a bowling alley. The thermodynamics of thin air. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was a thick, fragrant soup of mountain mist, damp upholstery, and the sharp, acidic tang of high-altitude exhaust. My internal sensors were recording a steady drop in atmospheric pressure, which had a direct, irritating effect on my primary boiler. "Ennie," I rasped, my vocal gears grinding with a damp resonance. "I am currently calculating the boiling point of my internal reservoir. At this altitude, approximately 2,150 meters, the boiling point of water has plummeted to approximately 100 degrees Celsius, minus 0.00312 times H equals approximately 93.3 degrees Celsius. I am literally under-pressurized, Ennie. I feel like a tepid cup of tea in a world that demands a high-pressure espresso. If we climb any higher, I calculate a 78% probability that my logic boards will begin to hallucinate in lowercase letters." Ennie, however, was in a state of professional rapture. She was wrestling the beetle through a hairpin turn, her face lit by the silver glow of the mist. "It's not a hallucination, Mr. Twain. It's the Yapaos. Look at them." The mechanical marvel of the Yapao. Emerging from the emerald fog like a squadron of motorized pack mules were the Willys Jeeps, locally known as Yapaos. These were M38 or CJ series Jeeps from the 1940s and 50s, but they had been transformed into something that defied the original blueprints of the Willys Overland Company. They were loaded with a structural audacity that I found personally offensive to my sense of balance. Piles of coffee sacks, crates of plantains, furniture, and occasionally a live goat were stacked 10 feet high, all secured with a web of hemp rope and optimism. The Yapao physics. The loading was so rear-heavy that many drivers relied on a peak, intentionally lifting the front wheels off the ground to balance the load over the rear axle during steep climbs. The scent, a glorious heavy cocktail of unrefined diesel, roasted coffee beans, and wet canvas. The sound, the high-pitched whine of low-range four-wheel drive echoing off the canyon walls. "Observe the center of gravity on that vehicle, Ennie," I drawled, venting a short pressurized hiss of steam. "It is located somewhere in the lower stratosphere. The driver is not navigating. He is performing a continuous high-speed act of liturgical faith." "It's beautiful, Mr. Twain," Ennie beamed, waving a grease-smudged hand at a driver who was currently passing us on a 20% grade while balanced on two wheels. "It's pure mechanical adaptation. They've turned a military scout car into a regional circulatory system." The coffee axis audit. We pulled the gasping Beetle to a stop at a viewpoint overlooking the Valle de Cocora, where the towering wax palms, the tallest in the world, rose like white skeletal fingers through the green mist. Component, status, observation, Honduran clutch, stretched. The galvanized wire is thinning under the strain of the Caldas grades. Brakes smoking. The descent into the valley has achieved a blue haze thermal state. Engine lean. Ennie has leaned the mixture so far it's running on mountain air and stubbornness. Twain. Damp. External brass plating is developing a mossy patina. "We need to tighten the clutch linkage before the border," Ennie announced, diving into her toolbox. "The next leg is the Paso de la Linea. It makes the Mountain of Death look like a driveway." I shall prepare my internal relief valves for the inevitable spike in indignation, I sighed, looking out over the endless mist-shrouded coffee plantations. But for now, Ennie, please find me a cup of that liquid logic you humans are so fond of. I suspect I'm going to need the stimulant.